The sky over Miller's Creek, Ohio, turned the color of a bruise. It was June 14th, a Tuesday. Hail the size of marbles fell for 11 minutes straight. Corn stalks snapped in half across the county. Soybean fields turned to green mush. But on 40 acres just past the county line, one field stood almost untouched. Rows of white, tightly wrapped heads sat under torn plastic netting, dented but alive. A pickup truck rolled up slow. A man stepped out and stared. It was Gary Nolan, the farmer who had laughed at this crop 2 years earlier. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, looking at the only field in the county that survived. To understand why, you have to go back 2 years. Walter Hayes was 54 years old. He had farmed the same 400 acres his whole life. His father, Frank Hayes, had worked that land before him, and his grandfather before that. Corn and soybeans. That was the Hayes way. Walter's younger brother, Ray, farmed too, just 12 miles down the road. Ray had 1,200 acres, 2 new combines, and a habit of reminding Walter about it at every family dinner. Ray never struggled the way Walter did. He always planted early, sold at the right time, and made it look easy. Walter loved his brother. He also spent most holidays feeling smaller next to him. Walter's farm was drowning in debt. $80,000, most of it from 2 bad harvest years in a row. Corn prices had dropped. Diesel prices had climbed. His wife, Linda, kept the books, and she had stopped smiling when she opened the mail. Every fall, the 2 brothers stood in the same church parking lot after the harvest supper. Ray would talk about yield per acre and new equipment financing. Walter would nod and change the subject. Linda noticed it every year. She never said anything in front of Ray. She just squeezed Walter's hand a little tighter on the drive home. "We can sell 40 acres to the Hendersons," Linda said one night at the kitchen table. "It clears the debt. We keep the rest of the farm." Walter shook his head. "That's not a fix, Linda. That's giving up a piece of it. Next year we'd be right back here." He needed something different. He just didn't know what yet. The idea started with an old wooden crate in the barn loft. Walter found it while looking for a tarp. Inside was a leather notebook that had belonged to his father. Most of the pages were about corn yields and rainfall. But one page, dated 1974, was different. It read, "Larson Field. Netting held. Everything else gone." Walter had no idea what it meant. His father had died 8 years earlier and never mentioned it. He set the notebook on his workbench and kept flipping back to that one line for weeks. Around the same time, Walter drove up to Michigan to visit an old friend, Pete Sorensen. Pete had spent 22 years as a county extension agent before retiring to grow vegetables on his own 18-acre plot. Pete grew cauliflower, and he grew it well. "You're not thinking about vegetables," Pete said, watching Walter stare at a field of tight white heads. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about not losing the farm," Walter said. Pete explained the real economics. Commodity corn was selling around $4 a bushel that year, and after input costs, Walter was clearing maybe $60 an acre in a good season. Premium cauliflower, sold fresh to restaurants and specialty grocers, could bring $28 a case, compared to $9 a case on the commodity market. 1 acre, planted right, could produce close to 800 cases. "It's not magic," Pete said. "Cauliflower needs even moisture, cool soil, and protection from heat stress. You get one of those wrong, the heads turn small and bitter. You get all 3 right, you've got something nobody around you is growing." Pete walked Walter through the basics that afternoon, kneeling in the dirt between 2 rows. "Cauliflower forms its head," he explained, "only after the plant has built up enough leaf growth to shade and protect it. Too much heat too early, and the plant panics, sending up a loose, bitter flower stalk called bolting instead of a tight head. Too little water during head formation, and the curds stay small and grainy. Growers who succeed with a crop in warmer regions rely on shade cloth to cut direct sun by up to 30% during the hottest weeks, along with drip irrigation to keep soil moisture steady instead of letting it swing between soaked and dry. Timing the planting to avoid the worst heat, Pete said, mattered as much as anything else. Walter drove home with 3 pages of notes and a plan. He didn't tell anyone outside his own house. He started that spring by converting 40 acres. He didn't explain why to the neighbors. He just started building strange wooden frames along the edges of the field, tall enough to hold up sheets of white fabric. Gary Nolan, who farmed the land next door, leaned on his truck one afternoon and watched. "What in the world are you building, Walter? Looks like you're putting up a tent city." "Shade cloth frames," Walter said. "For what?" Walter didn't answer right away. "You'll see." Gary laughed and shook his head. "Cauliflower's a California crop, Walter. Not an Ohio crop. You're gonna lose this farm trying to prove a point." Word got around fast. People at the feed store asked Linda if Walter had lost his mind. Ray called and offered, only half joking, to buy Walter's equipment before the bank did it for him. "You've got 400 acres of good corn ground, Walter," Ray said on the phone. "Why plant something that grows better in California?" "I've got my reasons," Walter said. "That's not an answer." "It's the one I've got right now." Walter kept working. He still hadn't told anyone about the notebook, or about the line that read, "Larson Field." Netting held. Some nights he'd sit at the kitchen table with the notebook open, tracing his father's handwriting with one finger, wondering what Frank Hayes had known that he never got around to using. The first planting failed. Walter put seedlings in the ground the last week of April. By early June, the heads were coming in small, no bigger than tennis balls, and some had turned a dull yellow-brown instead of white. Flea beetles had chewed through the young leaves before the plants could establish. On top of that, a heat wave hit in late May, 5 days over 90 degrees, and the plants had bolted early under the stress. Walter called Pete that night. "I think I ruined it." Pete asked him 3 questions. When did he plant? What did he use for pest control? Did he have any shade cloth up yet? Walter admitted the frames weren't finished in time. "You planted 3 weeks too early for uncovered ground," Pete said. "And flea beetles will wreck young brassica leaves in days if there's no barrier. You need the row covers on from day 1, not after you notice damage. And once heads start forming, they need consistent moisture, an inch a week, or they'll bolt in a heat spike." Walter plowed the damaged rows under. It cost him nearly $3,000 in seed, plastic mulch, and labor. Linda didn't say much. She just handed him a cup of coffee and sat with him at the table. "We've got one more planting window this year," Walter said. "June transplant, harvest in September. If it fails too, I don't know what we do." This time, Walter did it by the book. He finished the shade frames before a single seedling went in the ground. He laid black plastic mulch to hold soil moisture and keep weeds down. He set up drip irrigation lines instead of relying on rain, giving each row a measured inch of water weekly. He covered the young plants with lightweight fabric row covers to block flea beetles, pulling the covers back only once the plants were established enough to handle light pest pressure. By late August, the heads were forming tight and white, wrapped naturally in their own leaves the way Pete had taught him to encourage. Walter walked the rows every morning before the sun got hot, checking the undersides of the leaves for pests and pressing a thumb gently against the curds to test their firmness, just like Pete had shown him. The mornings smelled like wet soil and cut grass. Some days a light fog sat over the field until almost 8 o'clock, and Walter would stand at the edge of the rows with his coffee, watching it burn off. Walter harvested his first crop the second week of September. 4 acres, test rows really, produced 1,100 pounds of clean, market-ready heads. He packed them himself into wax cardboard boxes in the barn, working late into the night with a single shop light hanging overhead, Linda handing him boxes as fast as he could fill them. He drove them himself to a restaurant in Columbus that Pete had recommended, a place called Birchwood Table that bought local produce. The chef, a woman named Renee Castillo, cut into a head right there in the kitchen. "This is dense. Good color. No bruising," she said. "I'll take everything you bring me at $26 a case." Walter sold that first batch for just under $2,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was real, and it was proof. Year 2 is where the real test began. Walter expanded to the full 40 acres. He hired 2 part-time workers for the season, a father and son team named Curtis and Danny Ruiz, who had experience with vegetable harvests further south. Curtis was quiet but exact, the kind of worker who checked every crate twice. Danny, 19, kept the radio on and knew every song that came on, which Walter found more helpful than he expected on long harvest days. In May, an aphid infestation hit 2 of the rows, curling the leaves and slowing growth. Walter caught it early because he was walking the field every morning, something Pete had told him never to skip. He introduced ladybugs, which fed on the aphids, and sprayed an insecticidal soap on the worst-affected plants. Within 10 days, the infestation was under control. In June, his main buyer hit a snag. Birchwood Table's distributor backed out of a produce contract, and Renee had to cut her order in half for 3 weeks. Walter's income projection dropped by nearly $4,000 overnight. He spent 2 days calling every specialty grocer within 60 miles. A small chain called Fielder's Market in Dayton agreed to take the surplus at $24 a case, slightly below Birchwood's rate, but enough to cover the gap. Then, in early July, the walk-in cooler compressor failed during peak harvest, right when heads needed to be chilled fast to hold their quality. Walter couldn't afford a new compressor on short notice. He called a neighbor 2 farms over who ran a small dairy operation and borrowed space in his refrigerated milk truck overnight until a replacement part arrived 4 days later. Gary Nolan, still skeptical, stopped by that week. "Heard your cooler died. That's what happens when you plant something that don't belong here." "Cooler dying's got nothing to do with the crop, Gary," Walter said. "Equipment breaks on any farm." Gary didn't have an answer for that. He just tipped his cap and walked off. By early June of that second year, something felt different in the air. The mornings were unusually still. Birds that normally stayed in the tree line along the creek had moved further out into the open fields, which Curtis said he'd only seen happen once before, right ahead of a bad storm back in Texas. The radio station out of Columbus mentioned a severe thunderstorm watch for the following week, nothing unusual for early summer, but the sky that Tuesday had a strange yellow-green tint by mid-afternoon. Walter checked his row cover frames one more time that morning, tightening a few loose corners out of habit more than worry. The hail hit at 4:40 that afternoon. 11 minutes of stones the size of marbles, some reports said golf ball-sized further north. Ray's corn, just 2 weeks from tasseling, was shredded down to broken stalks across nearly 200 of his 1,200 acres. Gary Nolan's soybean field, unprotected and low to the ground, lost close to 60% of its canopy, stems bent and split. Walter's cauliflower field, held under sturdy wooden frames and heavy-duty netting built to hold up under wind and impact, took damage too. About 10% of the outer, uncovered rows were bruised. But the covered rows, nearly 90% of the field, came through intact. Linda stood on the porch during the worst of it, watching the netting shudder and bow under the pounding without tearing loose. When the hail finally stopped, the silence afterward felt almost louder than the storm itself. She found Walter already walking the rows, checking frame by frame, his boots sinking into hail still melting on the ground. "It held," Walter said, more to himself than to her. "It held," Linda repeated, and for the first time in 2 years, Walter saw her smile the way she used to before the bad harvests started. Gary drove over that evening and stood at the edge of Walter's field in silence for a long moment. "2 years ago I told you this crop didn't belong here," Gary finally said. "You did," Walter said. "Guess I was wrong about more than the crop." Word spread fast after that storm. Ray called his brother for the first time in months, not to joke about equipment, but to ask how the netting frames were built and whether Walter thought a smaller vegetable plot might make sense alongside his corn acres. It was the first time in years Ray had asked Walter for advice instead of the other way around. "Figured I'd start with 5 acres, Ray said. "See how it goes." "That's about where I started," Walter said. "Took me 2 seasons to get it right." "Guess I'll call you when it goes wrong, then." Gary asked, a little sheepishly, if Walter could help him source shade cloth and frame lumber for the following spring. Curtis and Danny stayed on through the fall harvest, and Danny, still cycling through the same radio stations, started keeping a small notebook of his own, jotting down planting dates and weather notes the way Walter had taught him. "Figure I might want my own plot someday," Danny said, a little embarrassed when Walter caught him writing in it. Renee Castillo increased her standing order with Birchwood Table, and 2 more restaurants in Columbus reached out after hearing about the crop that survived the storm. By the following spring, Walter had signed contracts to expand to 70 acres of cauliflower, still keeping the rest of his land in corn and soybeans as a buffer against any one crop's bad year. One evening that fall, Walter sat down with his father's old notebook again. He called an elderly family friend, Ruth Larson, whose husband had farmed the land Frank Hayes once mentioned. Ruth remembered the story well. "Your daddy helped my husband build netting frames back in '74, during a hail year not much different from this one," Ruth said. "Everybody else lost their crop that summer. Ours held. Frank always said he'd try it himself someday, on his own land. Guess he never got the chance." Walter sat with that for a while. His father had carried the idea for decades and never used it. Walter had found it by accident, in a notebook in a barn loft, and built it into something real. The farm didn't look like Walter's father's farm anymore. It didn't look like Ray's farm either. It was something in between, built out of failure, correction, and a lot of quiet mornings walking rows before sunrise. Walter never framed it as a victory over anyone. He just kept walking his fields, checking his frames, and watching the white heads grow tight and clean under the covers his father had once imagined but never built. As Walter put it to Curtis one morning, watching the sun come up over the netted rows, "The ground doesn't care what everybody else thinks. It only cares what you're willing to plant."